everyone, and welcome back to Science Simplified. Today we're going to be exploring the cell cycle and mitosis, how these processes are related, their steps, and what specifically occurs in each phase. So let's get into it. We first need to understand what the cell cycle and mitosis are. The cell cycle is the process most cells in multicellular organisms do in order to grow and divide, and this is crucial for many organisms to grow and develop and to repair tissue to heal injuries. During this cycle, a cell grows, prepares to divide, replicates its DNA, and then splits to create an identical cell with the same full set of DNA. The cell cycle has several phases, and mitosis is one of those phases. So mitosis is the certain part of the cell cycle when the cell actually splits into two. There are also checkpoints throughout this process to make sure no issues such as DNA mutations occur, otherwise that could cause diseases like cancer. However, it's also important to remember that not all cells go through the cell cycles, such as neurons. So once these specialized cells differentiate from stem cells, they remain in the G0 phase, which is when the cell just does its regular function and can't divide to make more cells. Getting back to the cell cycle, let's now delve into its different steps. The cell cycle can be split into interphase, which is the longest, and the mitotic phase. Furthermore, interphase is split into the steps G1, synthesis, and G2, and the mitotic phase consists of mitosis and cytokinesis. The cell cycle begins with the G1 phase, which is when the cell continues to carry out its regular functions, but it also grows, replicates its organelles, creates RNA to make more proteins that will help regulate other steps in the cell cycle, and it prepares to replicate its DNA. At the end of the G1 phase, the first checkpoint is reached where the cell makes sure that it grew enough, has enough materials to continue, and if its DNA is damaged or not. Next, the cell goes into the S phase, which is when the cell's DNA in the nucleus is replicated, so when the cell splits, each new cell will get one full set of DNA. We'll probably make a separate video to delve deeper into DNA replication later on. Now the cell has two sets of DNA, so it has 92 DNA molecules, which is double the regular 46. A regular human has 46 chromosomes, which each usually have one DNA molecule. But after DNA replication, an identical copy of that DNA molecule is made and attached to the chromosome, so the chromosome would now consist of two identical halves until those are separated later in mitosis. Then it goes into the last step of interphase, which is G2 phase, and that's when the cell just continues to grow more and prepare for mitosis. At the end of G2, the second checkpoint is reached, where the cell makes sure that the DNA was replicated properly from S phase, otherwise the cell might do apoptosis, which is basically when the cell self-destructs. At this checkpoint, it also makes sure the cell grew enough and has sufficient materials to continue. Now we enter the mitotic phase of the cell cycle. This is when mitosis occurs, and it begins with prophase. During prophase, mitotic spindles form, which are like tiny ropes made from proteins that will help separate the replicated DNA. Also, chromosomes condense, and the membrane around the nucleus breaks apart. Next is metaphase, where chromosomes line up in the center of the cell. After metaphase is the third and final checkpoint, which checks if the chromosomes are correctly aligned in the middle of the cell properly. Then comes anaphase, which is when the mitotic spindles attach to the chromosomes and pull the identical halves apart, so the two identical DNA molecules from each chromosome go to opposite ends of the cell. Then, during telophase, which is the last step of mitosis, the mitotic spindles break apart and new membranes form around each set of DNA at the two ends of the cell. Then, the final step of the cell cycle is cytokinesis, which is when the cytoplasm, the watery fluid in the cell, splits and one set of the replicated organelles go to each cell, so this step officially splits the cell into two, and they are genetically identical. In summary, the cell cycle is an important process in multicellular organisms where one cell divides into two cells, and those two cells are genetically identical. It begins with G1 phase, when the cell grows and makes copies of its organelles. Next, in S phase, the cell's DNA is replicated, and then in G2 phase, the cell continues to grow. Then, in mitosis, prophase is when mitotic spindles form and the nucleus disintegrates. Metaphase is when the chromosomes line up in the middle of the cell, chromosomes are split during anaphase, and the nuclei reform in telophase.
Lastly, the cytoplasm splits in cytokinesis, and the two identical cells are fully formed. The cell cycle is important for things like growth, repair, and much more. With that, I hope you learned something new, and if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and stay tuned for more. Thanks for watching Science Simplified.